All right, so today I'm here to talk about the conflict trap. And the conflict trap is part of a broader theory known as the poverty traps, where scholars like Paul Collier and others seek to examine, explain this empirical puzzle of, in the last few decades, we've seen a number of low-income countries, their economies really take off. In fact, in the last decade alone, some of the fastest growing economies in the world have been African countries like Ghana or Senegal. But there are countries around the world that seem to be kind of stuck. It's not that they're getting poorer, but they're just not growing. And so they came up with this idea of the poverty traps to basically think about the systemic factors that are preventing that growth. The conflict trap being one that Collier himself focuses on, and the basic idea of the conflict trap is that a country that experiences conflict on their territory are significantly more likely to experience poverty. And the thing that makes the conflict trap especially toxic is that poverty is a major cause of civil wars. And so countries can get locked into this civil war poverty spiral where they're poor, which causes them to have a civil war, and the civil war makes them poorer, which then leads to more civil war. In fact, when we look over the last 20 years, all but one civil war has been a repeat civil war, meaning that it's not just in the same country, but it's actually between the same actors. And so that just shows how common the conflict trap is. And I'm focusing on civil wars because it does apply, the conflict trap does apply to countries like Ukraine who are caught in an interstate war on their territory. But civil wars are more common in the modern era. They're also deadlier and more costly. On average, civil wars last 20 years. And while that sounds really bad, especially when we look over time, that their average used to be 13 years, there's actually, I'm going to say sort of like a little side caveat, that's actually kind of a hopeful sign, is because the reason wars are lasting longer is because there's actually a lot of wars that countries that have broken out of the conflict trap. We're getting really good at pinpointing policy and economic interventions that can help, and so we're kind of stuck with the worst case scenarios, which makes it even more important to actually address them. And in thinking about the economic damage the conflict trap causes, in looking at recent data, so they're more deadly, they're also more economically damaging than some of these older civil wars are. A recent study found that countries experiencing war in their territory saw a GDP loss of 77% per year, which means within 3 years, you have nearly a quarter of your economy basically dropped, like cut off. That is an average. A country like Syria, that went from being a middle-income country with a life expectancy very similar to the United States, so very wealthy in a lot of ways, lost half of their economy within 3 years. So it can be very, very damaging in a very extreme civil war condition. Going into the ways in which specifically the conflict trap works, and the way that once a civil war starts, especially since most of our theories are civil wars, once a conflict begins, the way in which the economy actually begins to transform. And there are a number of short-term and long-term impacts that make it very difficult for a country going through a civil war to grow. Some of them are things that you see on TV, like refugees and IDPs, which are internally displaced persons, which are basically just refugees who've never crossed the border to a new country. But a lot of these transformations are things that we don't think about because we don't see on the media. And so I can't go over all of the details here, and this is still even kind of a short list, but there's a few I'm going to highlight. One, I'm going to talk a little bit about the way in which the normal economic institutions, the things that promote markets, break down significantly in civil war cases. The other thing I want to highlight before going on is to talk about one issue called the lost generation, because I'm going to refer to that quite a bit a few times in the slide. The issue of the lost generation is that when a civil war begins, you often have people fleeing to refugee camps or IDP camps. And they take their children with them, who were taken out of maybe stable education systems in a country like Syria into a very, very different system. And refugee camps do have educators in them. They do have education programs. In fact, in Syria, which was a middle-income country, there are actually a lot of refugees who are teachers. So they're actually running schools in the camps. But this is nowhere near as good of an education system, education experience as people can get in a normal country, or kind of a country not going through conflict. And so what the impact is that the economic opportunities for children who go through a conflict are significantly lower than even their parents' generation, who went through maybe a more normal education experience. They don't have the skills that are necessary to build businesses or kind of achieve their full economic potential. And so that's a way in which that sort of lost generation can have a poverty impact for decades after the war ends, even if you break the conflict trap. So that is something that is really important when we think about recovering, is how do you address that? But there's also more fundamental issues that begin immediately, the breakdown of those market institutions that are also important and often get overlooked because they're a little bit more abstract. So getting into when a country experiences a civil war, focusing on specifically these short-term breakdowns in those economic fundamentals. Again, these are things that often are not covered in the news because it's a little harder to see them or really pay attention to them, and they're also sometimes super technical. The first thing is that when a conflict breaks out in a country, we tend to see that their currency collapses. The value of their currency collapses both domestically and internationally. And there's a number of reasons for this. One is that any sort of foreign capital is going to be pulled out of the country. Anyone who's really wealthy, they're the ones who are most likely to become refugees, and they're going to take their resources with them. And the economic productivity is beginning to drop. And so the revenue that's generated by the economy is going away. At the same time, you have countries that have to sort of ramp up militarily because they're dealing with an insurgent group who's fighting. And so all these resources needed to be shifted to make their military more happy, which means that the government needs to keep spending with no revenue coming in. And so they print more money, which in turn drives the currency value down. That has a few direct impacts. One is that if you're a country like Syria, who is importing food supplies from the international community, suddenly your imports are a lot more expensive. And also, because your money's not going as far, you can't get as many goods. There's fewer goods in your society, and that triggers inflation. Civil wars tend to experience especially hyperinflation, which is inflation rates of over 150%, or even stagflation, where you combine that inflation rate with an economic recession. So when we think about, even if the war ends, trying to transition into growing your economy afterwards, there's a lot of problems you have to deal with, and a lot of things that you need to rethink about in trying to transition from the economies of war into the economies of peace. Luckily, and while it seems like this is very overwhelming, there's a lot of challenges, there are some policies that have been found to be successful, not in all countries, but work for a lot of them. And I'm going to talk about a little, one in particular, but I do want to sort of give some background on kind of thinking about rebuilding the economies of peace, and especially as we're transitioning out of that economics of war with that underground war economy, the warlord bankers. Also, supply chains tend to be run by like black market smugglers because you don't have your normal supply chains working. Again, driving up cost of goods. You need to transition into rebuilding economic fundamentals first. Because if suddenly you follow what we call the development theory as usual, where you invest in infrastructure and invest capital, if you're still operating under a market system run by the economies of war, all of that money is going to get funneled out of your development projects and they won't work. So you have to take stage 2. And there's a lot of arguments is that the development community tends to try to jump to stage 3. You need to focus on stage 2, which is actually focusing on post-conflict reconstruction and rebuilding those market fundamentals to make them healthy. That way, when you transition to the economies of sort of that development as usual, the economics of development, you actually are building on a good foundation instead of a bunch of junk. So clean out the junk first. There's a few things that countries, and I think development agencies, both in the country and in the international community, need to consider what the priorities should be in this stage of development. One thing that a typical low-income country doesn't have to consider is you have the issue of spoilers. People who benefited immensely from the war economies. The drug trade, smugglers, those warlord bankers. You need to get them to buy in to your system and either get them to buy in or eliminate them in some way. You need to address the crisis realities. Refugees and IDPs mean that you're dealing with a very large homeless population, which comes with its own problems. You're also dealing with, for instance, even if you have, especially in civil wars, insurgent groups, militaries that have been ramped up, you have to demobilize those combatants, and especially in a number of African countries, and in Latin America, we've seen the use of child soldiers. So you have to reintegrate them into your society and convince them to stop fighting. You basically need them to buy in to this new economic system you're trying to build. You need to prioritize groups most impacted by the conflict. The economics of development theories about development often focus on trying to benefit as many people as possible. The realities of war is that it disproportionately impacts certain actors. And especially you need to either get them to buy in or you need to undo a lot of the damage done to them. So in particular, the economics of peace, you need to focus on women, because they tend to redirect resources to children, which allows you to address the lost generation problem. And you need to deal with the former combatants, because again, you need them to buy in to be convinced that this new economic transformation is good for them. You also need to focus on building market capacity. While you can have markets in the absence of governments, they tend not to work really well. Think Somalia. No one thinks about starting businesses in Somalia. Because governments provide a number of support structures for markets, including things like, well, banking, sometimes public goods, but also things that we often overlook like property rights management, land transfers. If you have a legal dispute, a financial dispute with your business partner, can you go to a court to have it resolved? Basic rule of law, especially, is really important to establish. The other thing about the government capacity you need to focus on is this might involve a lot of deficit spending for a while. And it's because you don't have the revenue generated yet, but you need to build these things and it takes money. And so the concerns about deficit spending and responsible government, that needs to be delayed in an economy going through a post-conflict society, at least until those government fundamentals are rebuilt. Then you can start worrying about that. You also need to create secure environments. Again, rule of law, order, really important to establish in post-conflict societies. Because if you're an aid agency trying to build an irrigation system and your equipment keeps on getting stolen or blown up, you're not going to actually achieve much. Peacekeepers can be helpful, but if you're using international peacekeepers, they take a while to deploy. The UN, for instance, can take upwards of a year to deploy after the initial mission success. So you have to start thinking, kind of transitioning to the next point, what resources can you use locally? Because you need to act quickly. Most civil wars re-begin within the first year. So you need to start rebuilding the economies of peace immediately, which may mean relying on resources in the country instead of relying on the international community to mobilize, which can take a while. If you are going to be pursuing this, you also need to follow a logical timeline. There is a really good example of a UN development program in Afghanistan, which, dealing with a lot of homeless issues, they built houses in the most arid part of the country and forgot to provide water. So you want to make sure your development programs make sense and in order where they're actually building on each other. Build the water first, then do the houses. No one's going to move into houses where there's no drinking water. Those are the things to consider, and one policy solution that can help address a lot of these concerns is agriculture investment, and especially investment in subsistence agriculture. Again, not something that's going to work for a lot of countries, but things like Syria and Iraq have actually been suggested. This is a suggested policy. And has also been pursued in Rwanda following their genocide. There are certain things that focusing on the agricultural sector, and especially this kind of low-tech agriculture, can be very beneficial. It helps address the problem of food being rare. Food becomes more plentiful, which lowers food cost, which helps address things like inflation, because most people are buying food. That is a huge thing driving up inflation rates. It makes poverty, because people don't have to pay as much for food, poverty rates go down. Disease, malnutrition, food's more available. In addition, if you prioritize women, there's some programs that have women, give women property ownership of land plots. You can also rebuild your economic fundamentals. Agriculture can become the basis of a microbanking system. Farmers can take any profits that they make from selling their resources, their food at markets, and they can use things like in sub-Saharan Africa, there's been an explosion of cell phone technology and especially cell phone banking, allowing them to bypass those warlord lenders and reestablish more traditional banking that you could then scale up into regular banking. In addition, the resources that get generated and the skills that get generated in farming can then transition into other business enterprises. So again, you're beginning to build the markets back from the ground up and businesses back from the ground up. Finally, it can help reduce crime because you're shifting production to the from illicit trade to more of what we would call the informal economy. It's not quite there of modern economics, but hey, it's better than drug trade, which we often see in conflict zones. This has actually been a policy that's been suggested in Colombia, for instance, which was fueled mostly by, cocaine. So how do you do that? How do you support agricultural reform? Because this all sounds great, but how do you actually achieve this? Well, the first thing is what not to do, and don't give food aid to countries. That's often the international community's first response, like, we're going to give food, we're going to give clothes. Don't do that. That destroys local economics, and it basically undermines local businessmen, because how can they compete with free? And it builds dependencies. It makes sense to have food aid when a country is experiencing a war because their production has declined, but once they start producing things, that needs to be phased out. And in particular, you want local markets to be able to kind of self-produce and become independent. So stop sending food aid. If you're going to be sending resources, focus on resources that are, for instance, going to benefit the agricultural infrastructure. Build things like water supplies, irrigation systems, roads to get goods to market. You can also support farmer training programs. UN peacekeepers in Sierra Leone, for instance, actually ran a training program, a jobs training program for former child soldiers, which involved training them in things like agriculture and construction, because those were really good for people who often were forced into fighting, often as young as the age of 9. So they had no formal education, no ability to read or write. Finally, wealthy countries can engage in biotech sharing. Again, don't give food, but anything that can benefit farmers, that you're reducing the cost of production and increasing the chance of success, like drought-resistant crops. A lot of conflict areas, a lot of civil wars are in areas that are heavily impacted by climate change. And so having a more resilient food supply system going into effect can make farming more profitable and can have all of these ripple effects. It increases food security, reduces poverty, and has a ripple effect throughout the economy. And so some biotech sharing can be a really good way of doing that. All right, any questions?